In a previous video, I talked about faith as a field. Three aspects that show up everywhere, across traditions, across cultures, even in people who would never use the word faith at all. The relational vector, the cognitive vector, the embodied vector, or trust, belief, and practice. And I said that faith becomes unstable when one of those dominates and the others get ignored. What I want to do today is go deeper. Because when I started looking at the earliest days of Christianity, I found three people who each illuminate one of these aspects in a way that I think is still being missed, still being misread, still being flattened into something smaller than what they actually are. And I want to start with the one who gets the most distortion thrown at her. Mary Magdalene. Before we can talk about what Mary actually represents, we have to clear some ground. Because she has been buried under so many layers of misrepresentation that most people never get to see who she actually was. The first layer is the oldest one. For centuries, the institutional church identified her as a prostitute. That is not in the text. There is no scriptural basis for it. It was a conflation made by Pope Gregory in 591 AD, blending her with other unnamed women in the Gospels, and it stuck for nearly 1,400 years. The Catholic Church formally corrected it in 1969, but the image stayed. And it matters that it stayed, because reducing her to that label is a way of managing her, of making her smaller, of making her story about her past instead of her presence. The second layer is more recent, but just as distorting. The Da Vinci Code, the sacred feminine movement, the claims of a romantic relationship with Jesus, the idea that she carries some secret lineage or hidden divine status. None of that is in the text either. And while it overcorrects the prostitute label by elevating her, it still misses her, because it makes her story about something other than what she actually did. The third layer comes from the Gnostic Gospels. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip. These texts do present her as a significant figure, and some of what they contain is worth reading, but they also get used to project onto her a theological role she isn't given in the red letters. And when we do that, we lose her again. So who is she when you strip all of that away? She is the person who stayed. When the disciples scattered, she was at the cross. When the Sabbath ended, she was at the tomb before dawn. When she encounters the risen Christ and doesn't recognize him at first, it isn't until he says her name that everything resolves. She turns. That's it. One word, one turn. That is the relational vector at its most concentrated. Pure orientation. The soul that knows which direction is north the moment it hears the voice it was built to recognize. She doesn't need a theological argument. She doesn't need a list of evidence. She turns because something in her is already aligned toward the thing calling her name. And then she's told, go. Don't hold on. Move, because orientation that only clings isn't yet fully alive. Trust has to become direction. And she goes. She becomes the first witness, the first one sent. In a culture that didn't count women as valid legal witnesses, the risen Christ sends a woman to carry the most important news in human history. That is a red letter moment, and it belongs to her. Now Thomas also appears in the Gnostic tradition. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the most studied non-canonical texts in early Christianity, and like the Gospel of Mary, it gets used to project things onto him that pull him away from what he actually represents. So he carries his own layer of distortion, just from a different direction. But the distortion that does the most damage to Thomas is simpler and more common than any Gnostic text. We call him Doubting Thomas, and we say it like it's a flaw. It isn't. Look at what Thomas actually does. The other disciples tell him they've seen the risen Christ, and Thomas says, I need to see the wounds. I need to touch them. I need to know this is real before I say it's real. That is not weakness, that is integrity. That is the cognitive vector doing exactly what it's supposed to do, refusing to carry weight it hasn't verified. Belief that doesn't test what it's being asked to hold isn't strong belief. It's borrowed certainty. And borrowed certainty is one of the most dangerous things in religion. Here's what I think gets missed about Thomas. Jesus reserved his sharpest, most critical words, not for doubters, not for the questioning, not for the ones who said, "I need more before I can move forward." He saved that heat for the religiously certain, for the Pharisees, for the ones who had built systems and institutions and hierarchies where God should have been, for the ones who were so sure they were right that they couldn't recognize truth standing directly in front of them. Thomas wasn't that. Thomas was honest. And when Christ appears and says, "Touch the wounds," that isn't a rebuke. That's presence, meeting the part of us that won't move until meaning is confirmed. Christ doesn't punish Thomas for asking. He shows up for him. What Thomas brings to the faith field is something that gets undervalued in a lot of Christian spaces. The willingness to ask hard questions, the refusal to perform certainty you don't actually have, the understanding that belief only becomes load-bearing when it's been tested. That's not doubt as a destination. That's doubt as the process by which real faith gets built. And now Stephen. Of these three figures, Stephen is the one I think deserves the most attention and gets the least. He is the first Christian martyr, the first person to die for this faith after Christ himself. And there isn't much written about him. He appears in the book of Acts, he preaches, he's arrested, he's brought before the council, and he's executed by stoning. But here's what he does in that moment. As he's dying, he looks up and says, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Read that slowly, because you've heard something like it before. On the cross, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Stephen, the first person to die for this faith, dies with the words of Christ still in his mouth. Under maximum pressure, facing death, he doesn't harden, he doesn't curse, he forgives, out loud, in real time. He reproduces the exact posture of Christ at the moment it costs him everything. That is the embodied vector at its fullest expression. Not faith as something you say, not faith as something you feel, faith as something that has gone all the way through you, into your bones, into your last breath. Practice so complete that under the weight of death, it doesn't collapse. It holds, and it holds in the shape of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not incidental to Stephen's story, it is the story, and it is not incidental to this faith, it is the center of it. So here's where I land with all three of them. Mary brings full orientation. Thomas brings full integrity of belief. Stephen brings full embodiment of practice. And each of them does it in a way that runs through forgiveness. Mary's loyalty is a form of it. Thomas's honesty refuses the bitterness that hardens into cynicism, and Stephen speaks it out loud while the stones are still falling. But none of them are the center. This is what I mean when I talk about a faith field rather than a faith formula. You are never just one of these. You move within the field. Some seasons you are heavy on the Mary side, turned toward something you can't fully explain but can't stop moving toward. Some seasons you are Thomas, needing to touch the wound before you can say it's real. Some seasons you are Stephen, and what you believe has to show up in what you do, or it means nothing. The field is always active. All three vectors are always present. What determines whether the field holds together or pulls apart isn't which vector is strongest in you right now. It's what's at the center. Jesus doesn't occupy one of these vectors. He is the fixed point that all three organize around. He is the who that Mary turns toward. He is the truth that Thomas finally touches. He is the reason Stephen's last breath is forgiveness instead of rage. Remove him from the center, and the vectors don't disappear. They just stop converging. They start pulling in different directions. And faith becomes something you manage instead of something that holds you. So the question I keep sitting with, and the one I want to leave you with, is this. Right now in this season, which vector are you living mostly in? And whatever your answer is it pointed toward Christ?